sit right
well,
here.
I was thinking of showing a couple of minutes of video at the end.
Okay.
So.
Would this be a better place to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. People banging.
No, I don't need to sit.
People banging gongs and things like that.
Well, people clapping hands.
All right.
Or hand clapping.
The sound of 3 hands clapping. All right.
So I'm just going to basically read what I wrote, but this may seem like a very strange topic to do in a class on Jewish theological culture, but hopefully by talking about this, it will become a bit more clear. And I hope some of you also had a chance to read the sections that I sent out. And I also want to say, feel free to ask questions and to correct me on anything that I get wrong. My knowledge of basically of Midrash is very slight. I do have some more background. I have quite a bit of background in studying Tibetan philosophy, Tibetan Buddhist practice and philosophy and all that. So that's really what I'm sort of informed by. And I had mentioned to Professor Fishbane that I was particularly intrigued by this point that was made in this book about this commonality that this scholar saw between, and he came from and I'll mention more about this, but he comes from a long background of practice as a Tibetan Buddhist monk, but he's of Swiss descent. I think he's from a Jewish family, so he's got this very interesting combination of different kinds of background, and then he got a PhD. Anyway, so that's a bit of background. That's the
death knell, right? You had all this background and then you got a PhD. So
yeah, exactly.
So much for him.
Okay, so perhaps one of the most pervasive impressions that comes to mind for many people when thinking about Buddhism is of a religious tradition whose main focus is freedom from the suffering of the world and attainment of a deep state of peace and tranquility. We might envision a figure of the Buddha, calmly seated with his legs crossed, his face radiating a sense of profound serenity, utterly undisturbed by the turbulence and impermanence of the world around him. Indeed, the quest for liberation, moksha, or nirvana in Sanskrit, is a central soteriological aim of Buddhist practice, as most clearly elucidated in the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, which some of you might be familiar with. The truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. However, an aspect of Buddhist tradition that's less known but nonetheless of central importance is the emphasis on philosophical inquiry, which in Tibetan Buddhist traditions often takes the form of vigorous, intensive monastic debate. And this type of debate has traditionally been practiced by monks and more recently nuns. This is, unfortunately, they're kind of slow to catch up in terms of gender rules. But, so monks and nuns who are engaged in rigorous study of canonical Buddhist texts and their commentaries, both by Indian and Tibetan commentators. Philosophical debate is most highly developed as a didactic tool as well as a form of religious practice in the sect which is called the Gelug sect. So excuse me, I have to use a few Sanskrit and Tibetan terms, so they don't make sense. And this sect, the Gelug sect, was founded in the 15th century by the prolific and highly influential scholar monk named Tsongkhapa. So here's where say something about this book. So the Swiss, he's of a Swiss background, the Swiss Buddhist studies scholar George Dreyfus, who spent some 15 years training as a monk in Tibetan monastic universities, eventually becoming the first Westerner to obtain the degree of Geshe, and Geshe is the highest monastic degree given by these Tibetan universities, after which he earned a PhD at the University of Virginia. He has written this fascinating account of his experiences and the system of Tibetan philosophical training in this book, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping. So just as an aside, this title, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping, if you've ever, this is a fairly well-known Zen koan which says, what is the sound of one hand clapping? So it's this sort of paradoxical phrase, but in the Tibetan tradition of debate, they do a lot of this. So that's why it's the sound of two-hand clapping. It's a bit of a pun on that. And I'll show the video that shows also a little bit of this very physical part of the debate process, which is why they're clapping their hands all the time. So Dreyfus has also noted interesting and perhaps surprising similarities to other religious traditions. And in this presentation, I'll explore this idea advanced by him that the Jewish tradition of Midrash, the interpretation of the Torah, bears a few striking similarities to the Tibetan system of debate. So somebody visiting a Tibetan monastery for the first time might expect to enter the world of calm and tranquility, to be met only with sweet perfume of incense, the sounds of peaceful chanting, and perhaps the soothing chirping of birds. But they would be in for a rude shock upon being assaulted by a tremendous clamor and the appearance of hundreds of shaven-headed monks, some in pairs, some in larger groups, boisterously arguing, shouting, and shoving each other, clapping their hands, stomping their feet, each trying to defeat their opponents and establish their own assertions as correct. It's hardly the image one may have of the peaceful Buddha sitting in one's garden. And yet these are indeed Buddhist monks, completely committed to the Buddha Dharma, the Buddha's doctrine. And they're engaged in a highly formalized and dynamic form of analysis of Buddhist thought, a hermeneutical process that begins with relatively simple concepts, like comparison between colors and shapes, or red and white, and very simple things, and clarification of basic terms and definitions. And this gradually progresses to extremely subtle discussions of the doctrines of shunyata, which is emptiness, or the intricacies of karma, causality, cause and effect, and so forth. So for these monks and nuns, debate is part of the process of cultivating insight into the deepest levels of reality as expressed in the Buddhist teachings, gradually preparing the mind for the liberative states that the Buddha himself is believed to have experienced. They'll often debate from early in the morning until late at night, pausing only for meals and communal religious ceremonies. And the debates are based on texts that have been painstakingly committed to memory. They memorize them word for word, line for line. I'm not sure if would this be similar in the Jewish tradition, that there's a process of total memorization?
There was once.
There was, okay. Well, they still do this. So they've painstakingly committed this to memory, and it often consists of Tibetan commentaries on canonical Indian Buddhist texts by authors such as Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, and Dharmakirti, which we're talking ancient. These are from 8th century and before, or around the 8th century and around that time. And these commentaries are normally written by scholars within their specific lineage, with most major monasteries having their own textbooks presenting specific interpretations of that institution. So each monastery would have slightly different doctrines, slightly different interpretations of some of the key ideas of Buddhism. So even in one sect, there can be a wide array of interpretations at many points. The monks receive oral teachings from their teachers on these texts, thus adding another level of commentary to this process. At the very least, the monks will then memorize a written commentary, which is based on what's called a root text or primary text, listen to and assimilated their teacher's explanations, and then by debating, they add another more open, dynamic level of exegesis to this equation. So Dreyfus argues that the Tibetan tradition of debate is similar in ways to the Midrashic interpretation of the Torah in the Jewish tradition, although with important differences. Drawing partially on ideas explored by the scholar David Stern, he explores the notion of Midrashic polysemy. I hope I'm saying this right, I'm not sure. Polysemy, so is that the right pronunciation? The hermeneutical approach of rabbinic commentary in which divergent interpretations of the Torah may be seen as equally valid. Specifically, he focuses on Stern's claim that such polysemy is unique to the Jewish tradition. This claim, writes Dreyfus, is worth considering in some detail, since Tibetan interpretation may seem similar to Midrashic polysemy in that it posits the possibility and necessity of closure while at the same time allowing some room for interpretive freedom. So for Dreyfus, the similarity lies in the fact that both traditions thrive on a dynamic, ever-shifting approach to religious exegesis. We might think of this as a highly developed system of checks and balances against doctrinal fundamentalism, where truth is always open to discussion and questioning. He cites a famous story of Rabbi Eleazar, who discusses a question of purity with other rabbis, arriving at a conclusion that even supersedes a direct proclamation from God, who then exclaims, "My children have defeated me." Dreyfus sees this as an indication that within the Jewish tradition, all interpretations within those limits can be regarded as equally valid, even if they're contradictory. This apparent openness of the Midrashic tradition would at first seem to differ from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, in which one seeks to arrive at a single, most valid understanding of reality according to the Buddhist teachings. Although it's true that different levels of meaning are taught in the Buddhist tradition, this is generally seen as an example of the Buddha's skillful means, or upaya, in teaching according to the varying capacities of disciples. So he would give different, maybe a simpler, grosser level of teaching to people who are not as spiritually prepared or advanced, and the more subtle, he hit them with the sort of the deeper stuff if they're prepared for it. To teach the deepest level of truth to an unprepared disciple would be unwise and possibly even dangerous. Ultimately, it would be argued that is a final, ultimate, definitive interpretation, but, and this is the key, it can only be arrived at systematically by studying and refuting the incorrect interpretations. This is where the debating monks and nuns come in. According to Buddhist theory, one must gradually work to uproot and abandon the wrong conceptions founded on the ignorance that binds us to suffering. Thus, by thoroughly memorizing, internalizing, and debating the so-called lower systems of thought, they become highly proficient in identifying any internal contradictions, and thus eventually understanding the higher points of view. A skilled debater is not just somebody who can accurately present the officially approved doctrine, but who can approach an argument from several points of view, even if they seem contradictory. The debater makes extensive use of the method of reductio ad absurdum, seeking in every way possible to expose the flaws and absurd consequences of their opponent's statements. I can illustrate this with an example from my own experience of studying Buddhist philosophy with Tibetan teachers. I was studying a commentary on the philosophy of Madhyamaka, which is the middle way, which is widely thought of as the pinnacle of the Buddhist philosophical thought, with Kensur Jampa Tekchok. He was an esteemed, highly respected scholar, Lama, who was considered one of the foremost experts in this particular school of thought. He would periodically pause his explanation to interrogate the students, to interrogate us on what we had understood, and the students would. And I mean, I should add that Kensur Jampa Tekchok was a very imposing figure, and he would teach his way of speaking and teaching was, when they debate, they get very, very intense, and his style of teaching was very much like a debate, and very loud and forceful, and kind of, almost, it was quite intimidating. And so then he would ask us what we had understood, and we, the students, would timidly respond with the correct Madhyamaka position, the highest view. And then he would immediately, and often quite fiercely, respond by arguing a possible position from a wrong school, leaving the flustered students struggling to respond. So, sometimes people would like, well, this is the right answer. And he would say, no. and he would say, prove it. He would, force you really to think about it and say, well, why is this right? So his aim was not to disprove the highest school, but to instill in students the capacity to thoroughly defend a position using solid logic and reasoning, even if it was ultimately not the correct view, thus ensuring that their understanding of the highest view would not be easily shaken. I do remember actually one time one person even ended up in tears because they were quite upset. They felt that he had sort of attacked them, but I think that he was really doing this with a good intention. It wasn't, it was sort of to develop a little bit of a thicker skin about these things. Thus, argues Dreyfus, the Buddhist practice of debate can be seen as providing the dynamism and openness openness that would seem to be lacking in the written commentarial literature of the tradition. And this is where we can locate similarities with the dialectical practice of the yeshivas, which Moshe and Tova Halbertal say do not function as a presentation of truth by the all-knowing scholar imparting knowledge to ignorant or less knowledgeable receptacles, but involve chaotic exchanges between teacher and students. The similarity between this description and my own experiences with Tibetan teachers is very striking. It can be a very animated, and I'll show you a couple of minutes of the video so you can see really how they are when they're debating. So in conclusion, it may be said that for the Tibetan Buddhist, as for the Midrashic scholar, the path to knowledge or awakening does not come about solely by sitting serenely under a tree, removed from the world, or by engaging in prayer, but through a process of robust dialogue and inquiry. So don't be surprised if you see a Buddhist monk or nun and they're more interested in debating with you than in talking about meditation.
Thank you.
So that's it. So I don't know if anybody
Please want to ask questions first, and then we can look at the video.
So basically, I understand that there's a didactic value to this argument, right?
Yeah.
That is there something beyond that? Is it like do they break new scholarly ground that is then written down and passed on, or it's just like didactic pedagogical discussion that teaches you, and once he has achieved its instrumental objective is left behind?
Well, it's not just didactic. I mean, that's
Or enlightening.
Yeah, I would say that it's really, that's the soteriological part. The religious part is that this is considered a way of sharpening your mind, sharpening your intellect, but not just for the sake of being a scholar, but for the sake of really penetrating more deeply into understanding the nature of reality and the nature of all of these topics like suffering and its origins and so on. And I think like many kind of, this is what's interesting about Tibetan Buddhism, maybe from a sort of anthropological point of view, is that it's it's really something that even now, the way that they're doing this is probably exactly the same as they were doing it 500 or 600 years ago. And so an innovation is a very, this is always, you're not supposed to improve on the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha's teaching is perfect. But you can come up, then there's the new ways of kind of, new arguments, new ways of coming up with things. This is a big, I think, it's a huge discussion within the study of especially Tibetan Buddhism is, that sort of, according to the tradition, it's considered sort of undesirable, negative to be an innovator because, because you can't improve on what is supposed to be perfection, but it's full of innovation in the sense like Tsongkhapa, who founded this tradition, was an innovator in the sense that he came up with a radical, they would say that they found the true meaning of the teachings, so it's always this delicate sort of dialectic of, well, are you innovating and coming up with something new? Because if you're coming up with something completely new, people would say, well, then that's not the real tradition, that's not the real teaching.
Could there be a point where the debate and the meditation come together? The reason I'm saying is that, for example, there are certain Talmudic traditions who are independent of knowing, let us say, the possibilities of the divine will. The purpose of debate is the purification of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
So one could imagine that part of the exercise is the purification of the debate so that ego is not involved,
mm-hmm.
and that the debate is not only for content, but for the purification of the abstractions so that the mind is honed in a different form of a meditative
mm-hmm.
state of purity, there are different types of modes of Talmud study, but there are aspects where it's a form of spirit, at least in some Hasidic circles, a form of purification.
That's very much a part of it. One of my teachers would always say that when you debate, I did some debate, but not nearly as intensely, as deeply. But we did try it. It's quite difficult because you really have to know things by memory. But one of our teachers would say that your motivation, you should be, on the outside you should be as black as a mountain. On the inside you should be as white as snow. In the sense that like your motivation should be very pure. Your motivation should be compassionate. That you're actually helping to sort of bring everybody together to a higher understanding. But that the external aspect can sometimes be quite rough and quite intimidating. So but so there's definitely the sense that this is part of not just an intellectual training, but that intellectual training brings you closer to what would eventually be realized through meditative practice, through an understanding. And they say so
it is a spiritual praxis. It's not.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Anybody else?
Well, I'm curious about the function of the verbal and memorization of the teachings.
Well,
that's part of the spiritual practice thing.
That's just. I mean, I think it's an oral. It was.
Is there a separate status for verbal teachings versus the ones which are written?
Well, the memorization would be like the first step, and that's just how they learn. That's just really the whole sort of educational model that they have had. And I mean, that comes out of the Indian tradition too. You would memorize, and it's actually very common that people will. I mean, it's completely different from the way that we approach education now in the West, in a modern context where memorizing just seems like, well, why would I memorize something that I don't understand? For them, there's no problem with, they'll have memorized, you'll have little kids, very young monks who will memorize a large number of texts, and they don't understand what they mean.
Right.
But it's a gradual process of then you get a commentary on it from your teacher, and then you debate it, and then you've got this whole back and forth where you start to understand the meaning more deeply. So the text in itself is only kind of like that memorization is only like a first step of knowledge.
Is there a process of meditation over the words and letters of the teachings, or that's a separate practice?
Well, meditation, unlike what the sort of common assumption about meditation is that you just sort of clear your mind and you just sit silently and don't think about anything. But actually, the broader sense of meditation also can include a kind of discursive, verbal aspect to it. I mean, even if this is internal. But so there is this whole process of kind of sharpening the mind and sharpening the intellect can be considered a type of meditation. So the texts are, in a sense, that can be the basis for meditation. It's just a kind of an analytical type of meditation.
No, I was asking just because there is a medieval practice of contemplating on letters and words in the Hebrew language.
In the sense of the
sense
letters
of
as having...
contemplating, thinking about letters just leading towards the
like the letters themselves.
Okay, well that would be...
Under the assumption that every letter leads to different formations of the name of the divine.
Well, that would be closer to what you've probably heard of the term tantra. Mm-hmm. Tantra is also a grossly misunderstood concept, but that's where there's more use of mantras and like Om, or you have all these, there's also visualization involved, where and there's also kind of deity practice where you're actually visualizing yourself as a deity, but that's where you would be dealing more with these kind of, I guess, the more esoteric elements of especially of mantras.
So I have some experience as a lawyer, so I went to law school. This sounds like the battles we'd have with our property professor.
They would be great lawyers, these monks.
Oh, absolutely, they would be. But this sounds like using this sort of adversarial relationship to try to discover a certain ultimate truth or reality or way to the perfection of the Buddha? Is that sort of what this is? Because in the legal tradition, what you do when you have a trial, allegedly, theoretically, is you have the two sides being adverse to one another, and that process is supposed to bring out the truth or justice, which it may or may not, but that's the theory. So it sounds very much like that kind of encounter with the professor.
Yeah, and it's actually I'll show you how they're actually set up physically. I mean, the way that it would be, there's always going to be a challenger and a defender. And the defender is sitting down, and the challenger is standing up and clapping his hands in his face and yelling at him and you know, sort of throwing all these assertions at him, and the challenger has to respond. But they have a very limited choice of how they can respond. They can only they can't just
from
sort of,
the text.
Well, yeah, and then they also it's a very formalized type of logic. They can't just sort of say, well, what I think is, and they can't give sort of creative answers. It's they're really trapped into, like, you said this and it follows from this. This follows from this, and you'd have to either say I accept or I don't accept, or prove it. And then so there's this whole back and forth, and it's with these very sort of tight sets of these very tight rules. So it's about really, I mean, arriving at a truth. I mean, ultimately, in kind of an ultimate sense, yes, that's what this is all aiming at. But in the sort of short term, it's just, well, you're just trying to find a contradiction in your opponent's argument, and then as soon as you find it, you jump up and down and make a fool of them.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll see. It's also it's very. They have a lot of fun. It's amazing to see how these monks are they're just having a blast, but they're also extremely concentrated. They're really, really sharp, but they're just like laughing and yelling and sort of it's very playful. So maybe, I don't know how playful lawyers would.
Not in a trial.
Not in a trial.
Never playful. Or in property class.
So there's nothing beyond the spiritual, intellectual exercise in this, right? It's like
you want this innovation.
Is there something some of it is recorded? Do they build a new knowledge based on this, or it's just like it's an exercise? Actually, what you're saying.
Well, the debate is one aspect of it. I mean, debates are. There are debate manuals. I was going to bring. There's an English translation commentary which is like this big. It's all about debate in Tibetan Buddhism. There are manuals, but those manuals are basically like very sort of a skeletal example of how a debate would work. And then you would memorize that basically. I mean, these monks would like memorize this, but then they're going to sort of improvise based on that. But there are many written commentaries and treatises, which are. But that's kind of. I mean, so the debate is, as Dreyfus argues, he says that's where there's this openness, and there's not this sort of closed system. Whereas the texts, there it's more closed. It's like, well, this is what the text says. This is the correct view. This is the correct interpretation. So debates are generally not something that would be written down because they're also going very fast. I mean, they're extremely, dynamic things, and these guys are like yelling back and forth sometimes.
So what is the status of truth? Could there be multiple levels? Is it an agreement? Or is it just at a certain point you have to then practice one thing over another?
Well, there are many different. The Tibetans kind of organized what they had gotten from Indian Buddhism into different schools, different philosophical schools, and they're considered as kind of there's sort of a hierarchy. Of what's the highest school and what's considered like a lower school. So again, that's where the idea of the Buddha sort of teaching in different ways, and this is also how how contemporary teachers would teach following this model, that you would teach different levels of truth to different types of disciples, but that there is considered a final, ultimate level of truth.
So the thing that I'm thinking of is a very famous example, but it's a very significant one. There's the Talmud passage in Eruvin, which is Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. So this and that are the words of the living God. But it's not the words of the living God, it's the words of the living interpreters interpreting the living God. And there's a huge medieval discussion on that philosophical notion of multiple truths, which express the methodological limits of understanding truth. And that becomes the approximation so that the divine truth can be multiple, because through method there's only so far that you can go. Those who are interested in read Hebrew, the very important collection and analysis and of Avi Sagi, it's called Elu ve'elu. And it's these and those. And it's a collection of the materials from rabbinic antiquity up to the 19th century. And it really asks the question of truth. What, in fact, could be the truth when the truth can only be approximated through hermeneutical method, right? And that you then say that you are dealing with different modalities. I mean, there are a lot of other issues that come up related to what you're saying, but this issue of that the method itself is a form of approximation, but within the structure of the human mind, it's asymptotic and you can only get so far.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's similar.
So basically, my impression, my understanding is that this argumentation, this sort of argumentation does not contribute to the formation of a tradition so far that it always remains outside. It's not written down, and it's always going to remain somewhat, I would say, in distinction from or in isolation from the actual teaching of Buddha. Is it correct? I mean, it's not like we think about a tradition of argumentation or argumentation which forms a tradition.
It definitely is a tradition. I mean, it's something it's a very
the argumentation itself, the content of argumentation. But there's no sense of. I'm just trying to understand. In to what degree are we speaking about, like, to what degree the argumentation becomes or forms the content or the conception, or the way we understand what tradition is in light of the teaching of Buddha, and how we are placed between the teaching and the argumentation tradition into, and what.
I mean, I think that it's a constant sort of interaction, in the sense that there is, I mean, while a particular debate would not be something that's written down or memorized, it's based on something that's memorized, and so, there's a very strong oral element to the whole tradition of, I think, all Buddhist traditions, and especially in Tibetan Buddhism. It's extremely important that you don't just read texts, but that you get kind of a transmission of blessings, they say, from your lamas, from your teachers. And so the teachers would be teaching you all this knowledge, and then you're debating the knowledge, and then you're passing that on to your students if you become a teacher. So it's a kind of, I think it's hard to say like where you draw the line between.
No, I'm just saying because I mean, it would seem to me seems like there's like some sort of a fundamental distinction between the Midrash and rabbinic argumentation, Buddhist argumentation. So far, the rabbinic argumentation ultimately leads to through information of halakha or tradition or customs to a very precise way of how we understand our tradition, and light of the content and also the way, the form of the debate as well. There's no,
So part of this issue is what's the telos? I mean, is the end goal to come as close as you can to what is theoretical and practical at the same time, or is the goal to exhaust the logical possibilities as part of that inner process of clarification, honing of one's skills. So it's a different, that would affect the notion of friendship and partnership between master-disciple or between friends who are debating, depending on what that telos is, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is, the ultimate goal is, and it's similar to what you were saying earlier, that this is, this whole kind of logical process is considered just sort of a stepping stone. That ultimately, I mean, like what they talk about ultimate truth and conventional truth, which is a huge topic that I won't even attempt to explain. But basically, an actual realization of the ultimate would be experiential. It would be something that's beyond concepts, beyond words. But these are kind of methods that are preparing the mind and also purifying the mind. They also talk a lot about purification of ignorance, purification of all of these types of afflictions that are preparing the mind, sharpening the mind in order to eventually be able to have this direct
So in some ways, it's a paradoxical, or it's a different form of a koan. In other words, theoretically, by being confronted with cognitive limits, one could be catapulted into no mind. And theoretically, you could get to a state like that through an exhaustion, an intensity.
Yeah, I think
one could also get to no mind from that too. Right?
Yeah, you could definitely make that case. I mean, there'd be some interesting parallels there. Yeah.
I guess I don't know if this is a different way of getting at the question that Svi might have been asking for, but to what extent is there a living, or in what ways is there a living, written, either commentary tradition or, if relevant, legal tradition? I don't know. Like what is like being produced, what is being produced in writing on the tradition now, not like internally, not from scholarship.
So what's being produced but not internally?
No, internally,
oh,
not
okay.
not scholarship, not like this. Here's
So this question's been coming up.
Yeah.
I mean, is there an
Sure.
accumulation of the tradition through the debate?
or did it like just stop at some point? Now it's exclusively oral.
No. There's, and I mentioned that there's, each monastery will have its own textbooks, and these are books. I mean, so there are layers and layers and layers of commentary that are going on here.
So ostensibly, do like the oral discussions that you've been talking about wind up, or I was gonna say wind up like becoming integrated into or influencing like future manuals?
Yeah, they could very well.
Because like a school has a certain style or something.
But I mean, again, sometimes it's hard to, sometimes the manuals will just be kind of a rewriting or a, slight adaptation of certain things, or maybe summaries of like, say you have a huge, vast text with lots of topics, and they would write sort of a summarized version of these topics so that the monks could just study that rather than studying, 15 volumes. So there's many different kinds of commentaries that are still now being produced, and even within a small, even within one tradition, you'll have many different monasteries, and each of these monasteries would have particular points of view about some things. Then they'll get together and debate with each other, and sort of hash out some of these differences. And there's also many, many different topics that they debate, because the training to be a geshe is this. It's like it's almost like a PhD, and people often compare it, but it's obviously different because it's a monastic thing. But it's about 20 years generally of training. So they're going through many different texts and many different topics. There's ethics. There's sort of cosmology. There's epistemology and logic and ontology. It's very a lot of philosophy. But so there's really a wide array of topics. I'm kind of wandering.
I don't know if this is might be too broad of a follow-up question, but I guess what is the main way way in which like novelty is integrated into the living tradition. I guess I'm thinking specifically like Tzvi was referring to like Halakhic decision making, and obviously as like the world adapts and changes, like more legal tradition is produced in Judaism in response to these like novel, like practical questions. So in what way is like novelty? But I assume that novelty does have to be, but I don't know, that could be an incorrect assumption.
It would have to be what?
I said I'm assuming here that in some way, in order for a tradition to be living, novelty does have to continually be like integrated into it, but that could be a false assumption.
Well, yeah, again, it's a slightly delicate balance because the sort of the whole training in Buddhism is to be humble and to sort of cut the to not sort of outwardly display any sort of arrogance and ego, but at the same time there is very definitely, I mean, that's, it's a kind of tension there, because there's definitely kind of innovation, like such and such a debater came up with this, radical new interpretation. But ultimately it all has to be something that they can say, well, this is
related to what was
this is related to the Buddha's teaching. It all has to go back to the Buddha in some way. I mean, they have to be able to prove that. Whether you're convinced of that or not, that's a different story. So there's, it's a tension between innovation and
But what is the impetus for innovation, I guess is the question I'm asking. Is the impetus for innovation like new ways to adapt the traditional teachings to contemporary Western morals? Like what's the impetus for the novelty?
Well, that's a whole other field of, because I mean, really I'm talking in the context of the Tibetan tradition, without even, I mean, then if we start to talk about it in kind of a modern context of the confrontation with modern Western culture, it's a whole other complicated, because then you've got also a scientific.
He's dealing with it as the internal structure of innovation by seeing a different dimension of the old logic.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a big difference here, I think. When you have a religion of commandments, there's a need to constantly innovate.
Sure.
And Mahayana Buddhism, or for that matter, most sources of Buddhism, they don't have anything comparable to the Jewish need to constantly keep updating the interpretation of the commandments, because they're ultimately dealing with how to reach enlightenment. And although you may claim that there is a huge difference between our age and what happened 2,000 years ago, it's relatively, the change is not even getting close to the change in the requirements for the commandments or the economic changes. I think there's something we have to keep in mind.
I'm saying I understand that the same structure is not in place, but I also, it doesn't,
maybe something that touches on what you're getting at is, because here, mainly what they're debating is going to be the philosophical stuff and the kind of the ontology, epistemology, and these kinds of things. But there's also a very detailed corpus of literature about the monastic discipline, which is called Vinaya, and that would be closer to what, like when you're talking about legal doctrines and things like that. That's where it's all about rules and divisions of rules, and what a monk can and can't do, what a nun can and can't do, what a layperson can and can't do. And that is where there's a lot more discussion about, the modern world and adapting to, I mean, if a Buddhist monk lives in a culture where it's not normal to go around begging for food, for example, or you're not supposed to touch money, there's all kinds of restrictions that they would have if you're really literal about it. But then, but that wouldn't be as much something that they're doing in debate as it is just in terms of a community and in terms of. But that is where there's probably more of that kind of that really becomes more of an issue. Is like, how much do you adapt these codes of ethics to a modern?
So he's talking more of the classic notion of a chiddush. In other words, an innovation within the structure itself.
Sure.
And then the question, as you say, is whether can that structure be absolutely new, or is it is nothing new? A Talmud Vatik is already replicating what has already been known. An accomplished student is able to do it. I mean, one of the classic definitions of the poet Yanai says that the chadash, the new, is mechudash. It's just renewed. So you're absolutely able to, you can tolerate innovation, but the innovation is actually
Recycled.
it's restructuring something.
It has to be based on some sort of an original truth. Or
So maybe we should see your
yeah,
video. I want to go around to see this.
This is
This whacking.
It's just one I found. This is basically one of the examinations. I mean, let me just watch a couple minutes of it.
I'll go around this way so you can
Okay,
show
yeah,
that
I'll
you
put
wrote
it up here. I'll explain it briefly. This is a this monk who's debating here. It's not a very high quality video or anything, but it'll give us an idea of what this process looks like. This monk, he's already a geshe, so he's already a very highly trained monk, and he's actually they're examining him here. This is a very formal context. So you don't see as much of, but I mean, if you went into a courtyard in one of these monasteries, you would literally see hundreds of monks all around debating with each other, very loud, very animated, and it's like this. And so he's, I don't even understand what they're saying most of the time. I can understand some of his responses, but the point is just to kind of see how this physical interaction.
What language is it?
Tibetan. I mean, I can understand, you'll see that, and so he's the defender, okay? And then this guy is challenging him, and there's, on the sides, occasionally you can see that there's whole rows of monks who are probably like the real scholars of the monastery. And they're watching this and maybe kind of, evaluating it. And this is also, the Dalai Lama had to go through this. I mean, they've all had to go through this. And then sometimes, others will jump into the fray and start, so they'll all together be sort of like, asking these very heated questions. So. So every time they make a point, they clap their hands. Now he's arguing back with him.
That's
So right there, where he was making his points, and then the last thing he did is he went to-tsa, and you go like this, and that's when you're telling them you've contradicted yourself. So I've knocked you out.
Is that when you turn your hand upside down as a contradiction?
Yeah.
There's a lot.
So there's all these, just very quickly, there's the symbolism of all these things. There's each of these movements. I'll also show, they get up and they'll bring their leg up and they'll go like this. And so this symbolizes, I think it's, then you'll have your rosary that you pull up. And this represents that you're suppressing the lower realms and you're bringing all sentient beings up to the upper realms, up to enlightenment by doing this. And it's also this union of method and wisdom. And then you're also, by stomping a foot, you're closing the doors to the lower realms, so it's a lower rebirth.
Are you sure you didn't study in Eastern Europe?
Very possible. So
There's a lot of desire there that's it's very problematic given their objective there. It looks like they're full of desire there. And it's something we're supposed to.
why do you say there's desire?
That's just the external aspect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, it's also, I think it's also an extremely, I found the little tiny bit that I've done of this and just being around Tibetans a lot, there's, I think we could actually learn something from this physical aspect of it, because I think when you're just in your brain all the time, the kind of study that we do, intense intellectual activity, when you're integrating it with a very physical activity like that, it actually, I think, makes it much more powerful in some way. And I mean, there's a lot of joy in it. There's definitely, there's kind of a boisterousness. And,
I'll start clapping when I argue with my boyfriend so he can keep track of the number of points I'm making.
There you go.
Yeah.
And I said that before, I said it again. How many times have I said it? Take out the garbage. It's great. Oh, we have to do it this way, we can't do it this way. Anyway, this is great. Thank you very much, Patrick. All right, so maybe as you were doing, I was trying to think of what would be the best text to follow up on that. So I thought maybe, why don't we, as a kind of a transition, we can take a look at that text from Menachot, Rabbi Akiva and Moses. It's at the very end of the last ones. I think I have it somewhere here. Yeah. Okay. Does everybody have it? I think this would be a nice. It raises many of the same questions that we've been talking about, but then we can look at a couple of others that deal with polysemy, as long as that's on the table too. And there's an issue also that Rachel brought up in different contexts. So let's take a look at the text in the Talmud from Menachot. It's a very famous text, and you'll also, a number of you actually wrote also on the text from on the Pesikta Rabbati Kahana, on the Para Aduma, on the Red Heifer, that deals also with these epistemological issues. So this is a different variation of the same issue, but it comes back to a lot. So does everybody have the text that we have? It's the text from Menachot, the Talmud, 29b, and you also should have the original if those of you can follow it, okay? So why don't we do it in the English so everybody can follow, and those of you who will refer to some of the technical terms. Those of you who are following it, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the narrow lines coming from the top.
What's it again in the English?
The Menachot. Does everybody have it? It would probably right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. It's right before. I think the stuff from the Fathers according to Rabbi Nathan. So if you're looking at the original Talmudic text, it's 8 on the narrow lines. Amar Rav Yehuda. Okay. So everybody have it? All right. So let's just read it through, all the way through, and then we'll go back over it. This is, it raises all the issues that we've been concerned with in a most paradoxical manner. So maybe anybody who would like to read?
Right.
Okay, good. All right.
Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rab, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, engaged in affixing coronets to the letters.
Let me just clarify this. So this is a text probably from about the 3rd century. It's in the academy in Babylonia, and it's referring to the episode of Moses going up the mountain in Exodus to receive the law, and he sees God putting coronets. So many of you, or maybe in the English, you've heard of a jot and a tittle. In the English, like in the Gospel of Matthew, there won't be a jot or a tittle removed from the law. So the jot, J-O-T, is really a yod. There won't be a yod, and a tittle are these crowns. So those are, if you have the Hebrew text, you can see that the original already very old. Actually, some of this goes back even much earlier, even to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there would be little coronets or crowns or curlicues on the tops of some of the letters. They were called little crownlets. That's the tittle, right? These little crownlets. So in other words, nothing. And according to rabbinic tradition, not only every letter, even the smallest letter, a jot or a yod, but even the calligraphic designs on the letters can be the basis of halakhic innovation. Okay? So God is already inscribing this tradition. So that's the background here.
Said Moses, Lord of the universe, who stays thy hand? He answered, there will arise a man.
So here, it stays in the English, mima akev. This is the first question, right? Mima akev. So in other words, who guides you? In other words, they're using a technical term. Under what what is compelling you? Under what prior consideration are you doing this? In other words, here God himself, as it were, this is the paradox. God himself is, the oral tradition is already going to be a written tradition, and the written tradition is already having in consideration what's going to take place in the future. So that the divine is composing the law and the jots and the tittles on the basis of something that is being ma'akev, that is holding him back because he's trying to bring in another consideration. They're bringing in a very technical legal term to deal with this issue. But the paradox, obviously you can see, of this question that Moses is astonished on the assumption that the text is not done, and God seems to be composing the oral text in a written way, but with a prior consideration in mind. Okay? And God answers.
There will arise a man at the end of many generations, Akiva ben Joseph by name, who will expound upon each tittle heaps and heaps of laws. Lord of the universe, said Moses, permit me to see him. He replied, turn thee around. Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows and listened to the discourses upon the law.
Yes, so he becomes like just a junior student, right? He's sitting at the very, very back. So here in this issue, Patrick, normally the head person would be sitting on various pillows and other people would be sitting around, okay? But the 8th row would be the most inexperienced. So Moses, who's giving the law, is sitting in the back in this heavenly academy, doesn't have the foggiest idea of what's being taught in his name, right? So already the paradoxes of history and interpretation are going to be, go on, okay.
Not being able to follow their arguments, he was ill at ease, but when they came to a certain subject and the disciples said to the master, whence do you know it? And the latter replied, it is a law given unto Moses at Sinai. He was comforted.
Yeah. So the question then is, this is the classic rabbinic question, minayin, or where do you derive it from, right? And so it's now the law that's being given is being derived as a kind of an absolute dictum, not even on the basis of interpretation, but as a kind of pre-interpretive tradition at Sinai. And then Moses, we'll talk about this, as Moses is comforted, okay?
Thereupon he returned to the Holy One, blessed be he, and said, Lord of the universe, thou hast such a man, and thou givest the Torah by me?
Yeah, this is a rhetorical question, so add the question mark, right? So this is a statement of questioning, of astonishment, right?
He replied, be silent, for such is my decree. Then said Moses, Lord of the universe, thou hast shown me his Torah, shown me his reward. Turn thee around, said he. And Moses turned round and saw them weighing out his flesh at the market stalls.
So this is the image of Akiva being persecuted during the time of the Hadrianic persecutions between 132 and 135. Okay.
Lord of the universe, cried Moses, such Torah and such a reward. He replied, be silent, for such is my decree.
Okay. So this is probably one of the most powerful and paradoxical anecdotes. Who would like to kind of jump in on this? I don't know if there's any of the technical terms we want to get in, but how do questions work, and rhetorical questions, and how is this whole larger notion of truth, teaching, hermeneutics, how does this question open up the deepest paradox in the rabbinic hermeneutical mind, in a sense? I mean, of course, it links it to the entire history of Jewish suffering, right? So anybody want to try their hand? Notice in the Hebrew, those who just, so while you're thinking about it, so this is Bisha'ah she'ala Moshe lamorom. So this is the event itself is taking place in the Ortzeit, right? It's taking place in the primal time of the ascension of Moses to heaven, going from earth to heaven. So there is a vertical dimension in time, in space, and there's also a different dimension in time. And then he sees God kosher kitarim la'otiyot. So that is this putting coronets on the letters. And then he says to God, Mi ma'akev al yadcha. It's al yadcha, right? Like, who's constraining you? The thing of who's staging it, but it's really who's constraining you. What is the epistemological or the type of divine knowledge that is guiding the calligraphy of the scripture? Okay.
No, I'm still trying to.
Okay. See, why don't you jump in?
So basically, so it's notion that ultimately the Torah, the source, the canon, is dependent on interpretation, on the innovations of the rabbis, which seems to lead to the question when Moses asks, "Why are you giving the Torah? You have such a man like such a Rabbi Akiva. Why are you giving the Torah? Why am I the one who's giving the Torah?" I understand it's going to be, what is the purpose of having this kind of two levels or two layers? One which is identified with the Torah given through me, the written Torah, the Torah of Moses, and then preceding that is the Torah of Rabbi Akiva, who would be basically a reflection or an interpretation of the Torah which I am giving. So why is there this kind of notion of two?
Right. So if the rabbis, in that sense, are asking the most fundamental hermeneutical question, right? So the opening question is the founding myth of the Bible is that the Torah of Moses is given by God to Moses, right? And the founding, as it were, the founding father, the founding episode of Akiva is that the Torah is a Torah of interpretation. And now the paradox is that the founder can't understand the interpretations that will take place 1,000 years into the future, right?
And so I guess it doesn't it seems not to understand what is the purpose of interpretation to begin with.
Well, they're asking, why was the Torah given to Moses if the founding principles of rabbinic culture is interpretation?
Which is precisely the question. There cannot be, the rabbinic culture cannot be rabbinic culture if it's not interpretation, but in order for it to be interpretation, there must be the giving of the Torah beforehand by Moses, and hence the play between the two.
All right, so I agree. So how does God answer Moses' question? He says, if you have such a person who can innovate all of these issues, why do you need me? And what does the divine say? He says, That's just the way, yeah.
That's the way it
Kahana b'machshava lefanai. No, that's just the way I. So it's not. There's a question that's the most profound question, and the divine doesn't give an answer. So what's the relationship between the hermeneutical problem, the hermeneutical question, and the divine answer? Which the culture knows. This is a founding, in a certain sense, this is a myth of rabbinic culture that's struggling with itself through a narrative episode. It's like an ideological myth. It's more than an Aggadah, right? It's an episode that is filling out something in the heavenly realm of history, but that's raising the deepest epistemological problem of authority and culture, and the divine doesn't answer. So let me go up this way. Okay.
I mean, it seems like if the founding myth is answered by divine silence, and that's like codified, that
is it silence? Or?
I mean, it's not silence, but it's like a validation of the myth in some sense. If there's no response, I mean, if the response to the myth is like, this is how I ordained it, that's that like validation.
See, now, if God in the narrative doesn't, that's what makes this so perplexing. He doesn't answer the way Tzvi answered, which is the way we would tend to answer the epistemological question. That is to say, without a founding text, you can't have interpretation. Right? The way we would answer the epistemological or hermeneutical problem is that you need a first document, a founding document, to have an interpretive culture. Right?
That's like a very deflating answer, though.
It is.
That's like why.
So how does the divine answer provide a much more problematic rabbinic intervention into its own problems? Let's go around. Yeah.
Well, I think in a way it affirms Moshe's primal question, right? What holds you back?
What holds your hand? What's guiding you? What's restraining you? What's restraining you?
But what's restraining you is quite literally, because the task of writing the Torah, in a technical sense, has not yet been completed. And so God answers Moses by showing him what might become of his Torah.
Okay. Let's spell it out.
And so, in a certain way, it reaffirms the status of interpretation. And so, as he says, right, you have to have a primal text in order to refer to at a given point. But from there, you just continue on and interpret. And as God is holding himself back by writing the Torah, and actively writing something on the Torah, showing Moses what will happen later on, it's something that Moses can't even comprehend, but that's okay that Moses can't even comprehend.
Moses is hero. So there's in the narrative form, there's verbal question, and then he's shown something, but not explained that.
Because Moses cannot understand, that's okay. Moses cannot comprehend this. The same way Moses cannot comprehend God's actions.
Right.
Because God...
Because Moses is not interpretation?
What?
Because Moshe is not the interpretation.
Moshe is not the interpretation. God, by binding those coordinates to the letters, embodies the action of continuing ongoing interpretation. Attempting to perhaps show Moses what might become of this interpretation, he shows us Rabbi Akiva. Not with the intention that Moses would understand Rabbi Akiva, because that's irrelevant.
I just find it very interesting this notion of God being part of the story itself. I mean, part of the story of one interpretation. I mean,
in a certain sense, you want to detach it from a time-bound, limited stream of interpretation. There's a telos here. What this telos might be, I don't know, because it's ongoing, right? So think about it very. About a unconcluded dialectic.
So finish the answer really to Rachel's to this question, like. What in the narrative? What is the function of saying Kahana b'machshava lefanai? This is the divine answer for the hermeneutical problem, the hermeneutical issue of culture, presumably that I determined that they're going to have to be layers, and that the layers undergo different forms of epistemological comprehension. And it's all going to be based, but what's interesting, of course, is that it's not only the verbalization of the words that Moses will recite at Sinai, but there's a written component that antecedes the oral component in the narrative. And so it becomes even more paradoxical in this episode. We'll go to the very end, but the whole thing. Did you want to jump in at this point? Yeah. Okay, Bennett.
I was actually struck by the end of the.
Well, let's wait till we get to the martyrdom thing at the end. Okay, let's just go up to this point because it just ratchets it up on a much higher level. Yeah, I agree.
I just want to allude to the fact that this kind of reminds me of like the Midrash with regard to God saying, "If only they left me and study my Torah."
Right.
This kind of the break between God, like control of God, concerning God, being replaced or being perhaps experienced through the rabbinical and oral engagement of the oral Torah. And that, so you spoke about, this was just in response to your, to the fact that you mentioned, God takes part in this process of the writing or the innovation of the oral Torah, and kind of puts it kind of more in a problematic kind of situation, given the fact
that. Can I add
before we get to the end? Let's.
Well, there's a repetitive notion of maybe temporal telos in each and every generation. So Shmuel b'doro k'Moshe b'doro, right? So the prophet Samuel is the greatest in his generation, in the same way that Moses was the greatest in his generation. And so every single stage. So
there are epistemological strata, right?
Right. And so it's not that Moses ideally should reach the level of Rabbi Akiva. It's not even the point. Moses needs to elevate himself to the level of Moses.
Well, it says, but the text is saying something else. It says when Moses can't understand, it says tashash kocho, right? That's very powerful, right? In other words, he's totally deflated, and what restores him? Simply that he's being cited.
Right.
In other words, that
he had
the notion of precedence is the key issue, not necessarily whether he understood it. Right? So there's a function, there's a God function in the text, there's a Moses function, there's an Akiva function, and then there is each generation that would read that. Right? And the first generation, of course, is Rav is the great, in the school of Pumbedita, he's the great Rosh Yeshiva. So let's go to the very end. So now he wants to know that first of all, you have such a person, you give the Torah by me. And then he asks the classical question, right? Show me his sachar. What is the benefit that he gets? And he sees this classic case of martyrdom, and he asks the most powerful critique, right? It's a stronger critique than Job, the way we began, right? Zos Torah v'zos chara. This is the Torah, and this is the reward. We began with the Job question. This is the ultimate question, right? And then God answers the same way. Kach Allah shtok, kach Allah b'machshava lefanai. So let's go. Let's see what you have to say.
Yeah, I think it's very telling that there are two things that are unjustifiable, axiomatic, dogmatic, beyond human rationality, and that are questions that cannot be asked. One is theodicy and the problem of evil and the problem of suffering, and the other is the oral law. And this just, I think, goes to show the very deep anxiety that the Amorim and the Tanaim afterwards felt with
Well, the
the
Tanaim are before the Amorim.
Sorry?
The Amorim are after.
The Tanaim
Yeah.
and then the Amorim dealt with a very precarious situation that they had with the oral law, that they had to compare it, in a sense, metaphorically, with the most problematic and unanswerable question, which is a question of suffering here. And what's even more amazing is that if you compare this to the Nitzchoni Banai episode, to the episode where the rabbis can tell God that he's wrong, it is okay to ask those sorts of questions, and it is okay to dispute God in that sense, so long as you're within the bounds of oral law. But it is not okay to ask questions regarding the legitimacy of Talmudic and Midrashic hermeneutics, and it's not okay in the same way to ask questions regarding the problem of evil. This is, I think, very interesting in that sense.
Yeah. But notice how they ask the problem of evil. In other words, look at the two, it's a diptych. There are two parts of it. So the first part is showing you the tenuous nature or the problematic hermeneutical status of the oral tradition. The master of the oral tradition, as opposed to the master of the written tradition, the master of the oral tradition is Akiva, right? The master of the oral tradition dies the most brutal Roman death possible, right? So in terms of, it's not simply a theodicy, it's to say, it's asking the harder question, right? That is it for the sake of this tenuous hermeneutical process that people are dying? In other words, Akiba, who becomes a martyr out of absolute devotion to God, because he dies with the Shema, the Lord is one, on his lips, or according to another tradition, he's able to fulfill the commandment of Ahavta, that he loves God. Okay, so there are two different traditions. So he becomes the most absolute, he's the most absolute interpreter of the oral tradition. He is the purest monotheist because he dies saying Echad, one, God is one, and he dies saying you shall love the Lord your God, right, with all your heart and soul. But it's on the, so I'm just deepening this anxiety on the basis of that interpretive structure, which is so tenuous that a person would give their life, right? It doesn't it's not as if Akiba is dying simply because he's obeying the literal word of God to Moses. He's dying out of commitment to the rabbinic tradition, which is an oral tradition, right? So it turns the notion of historical fate and destiny into this more problematic issue, this issue of Yom HaZikaron, right? The issue of generations who face martyrdom not simply out of commitment to the written text, but to the tradition, which is a constructed human enterprise, right? Based on the divine law. So it is that anxiety, but it's in an even more profound way, that the commitment to that is, all he had to hear was that this is a halakha l'Moshe Sinai. That somehow it's affirmed that this is not just whimsical, that there is some kind of cultural anger. And then it says, so at the emotional level, and this I'm spelling this out because we're trying to figure out the narrative form of this. So the anxiety is expressed tashash kocho. He became unloosed. He just became weak. And the counterpoint is nityashva da'ato, right? He was able to recompose himself emotionally and mentally. So, as we try to figure out the narrative structure of this and the theology, I think you're absolutely right to point to, this is a text of rabbinic anxiety, but it's an anxiety that goes to the deepest unanswerable issues, right? The paradox of the tradition and the paradox of becoming martyrs for that tradition, right? So it's in a certain sense, there's an encapsulation of the entire Jewish destiny in this small Aggadah. This, in a certain sense, captures the essence of the rabbinic understanding of themselves, up to the limit. It's a limit. It's limits in all directions, right? And they've captured this in this episode. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Again, I'm not sure that the issue here is specifically that he's dying because of the oral law.
Oh, how do you read it then?
No, I think that again is
because don't forget, according to the teaching in Brachot, maybe they're not even necessarily referring to, but at the end of the Talmud in Brachot, I think it's somewhere about 63b or something like that. The commandment by the Romans was you can't teach Torah in public, and then he teaches in public, right?
No,
so he becomes he's a defiant teacher of the oral tradition. He wants the tradition to be passed down to the next generation.
yes, but again, I think I'm not saying it's not true. I think the deeper meaning here and the most important thing is that he ends this whole discussion regarding the basis of the oral law with the other unanswerable question in Judaism, or for that matter in many religions, which is why do bad things happen to good people in that sense. It is true that it does. What?
It's linked directly to Torah. I think it's a question of
Of course it's linked, but
Yeah,
that's
but
not...
it's another dimension of Moshe's discussion or realization of the development of Torah given as interpreted by Rabbi.
Of course it's linked, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when you have to... The profound thing here is not that it's linked or not linked. The profound thing is there anywhere else in the Talmud, for that matter, that such an answer given by God be silent? Because I think, and I'm willing to, that the only two places are either places regarding the Odyssey, or the other one is regarding the basis in justification and legitimization for oral law. That maybe
this language is unique to this.
It's unique. That's what I'm saying. The uniqueness here, I think it's much more.
So, and also, what's the problem? I mean, it's
But the culture is putting in God's mouth the unanswerability. In other words, how would you express absolute fate in a narrative form? In other words, there's an attempt to understand that there's an unanswerable destiny, right?
I also think there might be a part, and this might be a little too, I don't know, too happy of a reading, but...
Positive, okay.
Right. But I think that there is this an emphasis on community that is big in Judaism, and I think that that's part of what the oral tradition really stands for.
Intergenerational community, or?
Yeah, tradition. We'll go with the term tradition. And it's almost divine in its status, in the kind of cultural consciousness.
What holds it back from being divine?
Well, no, it doesn't hold it from being divine. The point that I want to make is that what is special about it is that it's self-created. I think there is something, God bites his tongue, or says, doesn't want to explain it, because if it becomes a decree from God, it loses, paradoxically, its divine status, because it's no longer something that is self-generated by the following of his laws and the creation of tradition, but done for the purpose of, because God said. And that kind of takes away from its power. So I think that's the way I kind of reconcile it.
And the problem of evil and of having Rabbi Kahana tortured to death, how does it?
Well, so when you're raised to the status of being, when you're a martyr, you're doing something right for others. He's dying not for God, he's dying for the tradition. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It sucks. You know, it's
Would it matter? Would it change the status of tradition? Would it change the status of ongoing interpretation? What does it matter? I mean, I think what, in a certain sense, God's silence or silencing Moses here points to Moses. It just doesn't matter. Things will continue to go on. Things will continue to be interpreted.
But he's silencing the question.
He's silencing the question because Moses cannot comprehend this.
Yeah, but I'm saying,
And which is exactly the same thing what he told him when he saw Rabbi Akiva.
But I think that what I understand your question. I think that the reason that the language here is unique, or the part of what it alerts at least my reading to, is to emphasize this power of community rather than to say, yeah, no, I don't feel like answering this. Sorry.
The way you see it rhetorically, you have to look at it this way. The people who read this, I mean, they were probably aware that the problem of evil is unanswerable. And it's an issue that needs to be done right. It's like, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but it's something...
Well, it's not just evil, it's the suffering of the suffering of the nation for this tradition. Because of this tradition, in other words, they weren't willing to convert or give up the tradition. So it's not just evil. It's the issue of suffering for this particular tradition. Right?
And I think that basically what they're doing is giving a structural equivalence with the problem of the suffering for tradition, the problem of evil, or which is a specific case where they tell you, just as you know that you cannot answer this specific issue of good people suffering, the question of the justification for the oral law is unanswerable and done.
But he's not just a good person. He is the prime teacher. In other words, he's the archetypal oral tradition, just like Moses is the archetype of the written Torah. So his death is the danger of this death of the tradition itself. And the divine voice is put into this teaching of Rav in the 3rd century is that it can't be explained, right? And somehow there is a divine this is a mysterious destiny of Jewish destiny. And this is the ultimate paradox of Jewish history, right? Hermeneutics and suffering. Those are the two parts of Jewish destiny, and both are brought to this incomprehensible level of fate. The culture is predicated on hermeneutics, and it's predicated, and it knows suffering. And the two are deeply entwined.
Well, just a really quick note. It's not that there's no reason. I mean, God silences Moses, telling him, "This is my decree. This is my reason. There is a reason out there."
But he doesn't say gezerah. He doesn't say decree.
This is my thought. This is my internal reason for this.
This is the way I determined it. This is the way I determined it, right?
Which implies
But it's
some sort
it's
of-
not as strong.
But
It's not-
it
it's
doesn't
not-
matter. I mean,
Okay.
Moses can't even.
Well, I'm trying to stay with the narrative form, like what?
Of course, but I say this because God answers him. He doesn't silence him. He silences him and gives him somewhat of a second quasi explanation. This is my decree. Or Kahana, right? The English is not.
You should, of course, you need to read this against different Midrashim.
We don't need next
The
week.
famous Midrash of
2
the
weeks. We need 2 weeks.
the famous Midrash of the 10 10
Martyrs.
martyrs.
Yeah.
Exactly. And some Midrashim there are explanations, right, against kind of paying off the debt of the brothers of Yosef.
Are there other places without explanation?
No, but there's no. I'm trying to say is you need to read this against. I mean, there is the rabbis are able to provide answers, are able to create rationales to place we're going to get
But just with the
historical.
here.
I mean, you could create some sort of a context, rational context in which you can actually place this kind of seemingly absurd of this, and therefore you need to read this against these sources, and only in that the sources kind of appreciate what exactly they're trying to ask and to determine with regard to this particular midrash.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it is still the problem. Those texts that you're reading it against are either vicarious punishment, according to that. They're being punished because Joseph had committed a certain, the brothers of Joseph had committed a certain kind of offense, or in the medieval tradition, it's because they provide a certain atoning function. But here, the notion of punishment or atonement, the two rabbinic ways of dealing with that, right? That the person is either being punished or the death is an atonement for others, are not part of the explanation.
That's exactly what I mean by reading against, by the fact that we kind of
that's what you're saying.
yes, the suspension of whatever could have been, realizing that the fact that there's an intentional suspension of any type of rationality that could have been brought or ascribed to this particular.
Or it's the suspension of any rationality.
Yes, and only against the Midrashim can actually appreciate this kind of notion of suspension, and then kind of further appreciate what the question is and how radical this question is, and not against this suspension.
Yeah, I agree. Anybody else want to pick up on anything here?
Just maybe.
You have to realize just what an astonishing episode this is, as far as a cultural statement.
The notion of silence. We've seen this silence here in Menachot, and there was another silence from what I think exactly the opposite direction in Pesikta Rabbati. When the sages talked about Solomon, while Moses was commanded to be silent, Solomon did not remain silent, which is what the sages explicate from Solomon, and just spilled out his full meaning, right? And through there they reached the above the sun, under the sun, and so on. The silence, in a certain sense, symbolizes some sort of level of comprehension. And so while Moses, and I want to return, and I've said it before, and actually my response paper was close to this. While Moses is commanded to be silent on issues he just does not comprehend, Solomon chose not to remain silent, talking about things which were under the sun, so to speak, right? Things that are given to his own comprehension, right?
But that you're doing also then what Tzvi's doing. It's you're using other texts to highlight something else in this text.
No, so is the text as a whole, where it's working and referring to other stories about Rabbi Akiva, about the giving of the Torah, and the text is not.
Yeah, but the text has its own narrative cohesion, right?
It does.
Any other text that we would bring in with this text about Solomon or another text about the other martyrs, we put them alongside so that we by contrast, we can pick up things that make this special. But within the narrative's form of this, it's radical and leaves the unsayable unsaid. Right? Anybody else want to add anything to this? Maybe let's do one more text. Is that we, since the issue came up with Patrick about polysemy, let's maybe pick up on the text that about not to have other gods. Elohim achirim, the text that appears in the Mekhilta. Let me just see. I think it's the text is from the Mekhilta, and it's so in the English packet, it's on 148. You shall have no other gods besides me. It's focusing on that, the part of the Decalogue, and then in the Hebrew source, it's page 223. Right, line 3. So in this case, we're going to see an example of the polysemous or multiple meanings that are going to be used to articulate a range of rabbinic reflections on what idolatry is.
Sorry, what's the name of the text?
The text is the Mekhilta of Rabbi Ishmael. It's on Exodus 20, verse 3. It's in the section called Vachodesh. Here it's on the English part. Did you have it under Exodus, Mekhilta de Rabbi Ishmael? Anybody have it to help Patrick? Where I don't know how it was put up on the chalk, but it's page 148.
We had
Then no, this would maybe was this not put up?
No, and then we had
Huh? I thought that I had passed it out. Oh, so you don't have it?
Oh, maybe it was one of the hard copies of
I think I gave it to you last time, didn't I? Yeah, okay. Oh, I gave it to you last time then, okay. Okay. Okay? Okay. So sit next to someone who has a copy if you didn't bring it. Okay? So we're going to pick up with... So the issue now is how around one particular word and series of questions the rabbis, again, we're seeing how the rabbis are going to try to unpack. They don't do a philosophical treatise of against idolatry the way we might have in the church fathers, but you have a series of interpretations. It's in the Horowitz Rabbin edition, which I gave you in the Hebrew. It's 5. It's vav. It's parsha vav, right? But in the Lauterbach, it's Shrub. It's probably 5 rather than 4. I don't know, but it's vav, right? You're right. Huh? It's the Bachodesh. Okay. Does everybody have? You have a. Rachel, do you have a copy?
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't you and okay? Do you have the Hebrew too?
No, I
Okay. So let's take a look at let's do the English. So Rachel, why don't you begin?
The Lord the Warrior?
No, you shall have no other gods besides me. It's page 149 in the English. Lo yelecha Elohim achirim.
No, I thought I had the document. I don't have it. Feel free.
I may have more copies upstairs, but I don't know. See if we can try to move. You have it?
Should be somewhere over
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So why don't you read, Rachel?
No, it's not like, it's not
What?
in this packet.
No, it's not good.
Sorry.
Wait, these are how you people
Does anyone have the English?
Here, why don't you?
No.
All right.
No, I have it.
Sorry.
Yeah, we don't have this.
Okay.
Why don't you use mine?
Sorry.
Use mine. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So let's read it up. All right. We're going to do it orally. We're going to have an oral study session. We're going to have an oral study session. All right.
You shall have no other gods besides me. Why is this said?
All right. So that's the key issue that the rabbis are raising. Lama ne'emar. So the question is asking, why is this particular commandment given in the Ten Commandments, in the Decalogue, in verse 3 of, you shall have no other gods. So they're going to, the issue will be, continually be turning around the issue of what acherim means, right? Other gods.
It's kind of self-contradictory within the context.
Right. Okay.
When it says, you shall not make for yourselves a sculptured image, this only prohibits the making of idols. What prohibits me from keeping those that were already made? Therefore the verse says, you shall have no other gods.
Okay, so you can see that the text is moving through a series of questions. Right? Lama ne'emar, why is it said? Because it is said, Lefisha ne'emar, you shall not have any kind of idol or image. So I could then say, Ainli Ella. If I had a limited interpretation, I could simply say that you shouldn't have what has already been made. It doesn't say that you should not make them in the future. It just say you can't use what you already have, right? Minayin shalo yikayim, right? So how? In other words, I could only interpret that I should make them in the future. But how do I know I have to destroy what I have? Shalo yikayim. They can't keep them at this. Anymore, Talmud lomar, because Scripture says, "Lo yihiyeh lecha Elohim acherim." Right? You should have none. So, in other words, here we have a question that uses the precision of the verbal formulation of the prohibition, but it's not just being clever, it's trying to say, how do I know that I can't even keep the ones that I have, right? So so we're going to have a series of interventions, but each one is going to be posed by a different question. And now he's going to go on. What does he then go on to say? Another interpretation of Elohim Acherim.
Other gods.
No, but oh, is that how he translates it?
Yes.
So that's not good. So that's not good.
That's bad.
Because the reason I chose it because these are a whole series of multiple questions. So the next question that's raised, v'chi Elohot hein or Elohot hein, are they really gods?
Sorry. The next, are they really divine?
Okay. So in other words, they're already raising the question. Why should God have said you should have no other gods? Why didn't he say you should have no other images? Why is he saying gods? It's as if he's already doing a critical Bible scholarship. Like they already knew there were other gods, but from the rabbinic point of view, this is an intolerable question. How could the text assume that they're gods as if they were gods, right? It should have said, you shall have no idols before me. Why does the text say you shall have no other gods? So they're asking a real question. In other words, they're puzzling over the formulation of the law, but they're really asking now, trying to understand how that text could make any sense in a radical monotheistic culture, right? V'chi Elohotein or Elohut, are they any divine? He's reading it as if divinity, Elohut. You could read Elohot, are they really gods? Right? Right? Hasn't it already been said? Does he ask that as a question?
Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay, go on.
Okay,
so that's another question. In other words, this whole thing is sort of a teacher using multiple questions to get at these answers. It's either one question after another. Okay, so what is he saying? And what isn't it already been said elsewhere in Scripture? What?
And have committed their gods, the flames, and have destroyed them, for they are not gods.
Right. So how can you say they are gods? Right.
It says already.
Okay.
What
right.
then is the meaning of other gods?
So then he says, Uma Talmud Lomar. So why should then, if already we have elsewhere in Scripture the statement that they're not gods, why should Scripture say other gods? In other words, it's still a question. What I want you to try to see is how the questions are insisting on a problematic, but through the focusing on the problematic, they get at other theological questions. It's not just the contradiction on its own terms, right? What's the answer?
Others ascribe them to divinity.
Rather, she'acherim korin otam Elohot or Elohut. That is to say, it's as if, so in other words, it's saying, obviously, you must be right that if elsewhere in Scripture, in Isaiah, obviously, I mean, everything is part of the, as if it was all contemporary language. But since it says elsewhere in Scripture, in Isaiah, that their gods are no gods and they've been just thrown away, how could God have said at any point, you have no other gods? So since the text seems to be saying a theological contradiction in radical terms, we have to assume that we're not reading the text correctly. And so there has to be an attempt to kind of deduce what God could have said that it would be theologically palatable, but we're trying to deal with how the culture is trying to solve that problem, right? So God is saying, you shouldn't have anything of what other people call gods, right? She'acherim korim lehem Elohot, right? It's a fantastic solution. In other words, it's giving a polysemous, homiletic, punning, rereading totally against the plain sense of the meaning. You should have no other gods is obviously what it has to mean. But since it's a problem to say that if there's a negation of idols and other gods elsewhere in Scripture, what could God have meant that wouldn't be self-contradictory? And now they turn this, that you shouldn't have what other people call gods, right? But again, what we're doing is trying to see what we've seen before. What is the epistemological stratum that's bothered by the formulation of Scripture? How is the strategy of questioning opening up their own cultural level of theology? And yet you have to go back and ultimately solve it on the basis of scriptural language. Talmud Lomar. Scripture then, why does Scripture say this? So it has to mean something else. So you see a whole series of epistemological cuts into this, right? This is something we talked about from a different angle, but you can see that the problematic tells us something epistemological and cultural, and the literal meaning has to be the non-literal meaning, right? That's it's essentially what they're saying. Let's go on. Davar acher, another interpretation.
Other acherim, gods, they delay macherim, the coming of goodness into the world.
Now, each one of these, they are ma'acharim. They are prolonging the good to come in the world because idolatry is an evil in the world, right? So again, this must have been a huge sermon that was recited on some Sabbath. We're just getting a one-liner here, right? You're getting a soundbite. But it must have been a much longer discussion. But now the literal reading is really a homiletical theological reading. You shall don't have those things which defer the monotheistic good from entering the world. So you see, what the rabbis are doing is they're reading a literal text at a hyper-literal way to introduce a theological orientation of their own. This is a classic instance of Gadamer's, right? Horizont Verschmelzung, right? The combining the collapsing of horizons, right? the horizon of the rabbis couldn't tolerate any statement of the assumption that idols are gods, or that the text should even refer to it this way. So in order to close the epistemological gap between their theology and what Scripture seems to be saying, the literal level of the prohibition is now turned into a theological, non-literal statement without changing the language. Okay? So this takes us right into the depths of the theological power of the oral tradition. Okay, let's go on with another one. Another interpretation. So this is another sermon that's being condensed here, right?
Other gods, they cause those who worship them to be other.
Yeah. In other words, they're othering the acher. Like it's like Elisha was an acher. He was an other. He was a heretic, right? They're punning on the sense the ultimate other, the ultimate alterity. The acher is a heretic. So how do you read this? Those things turn their worshippers into acherim, others with a capital O, or the way I would probably read it, into acherim, namely heretics. Again, acher of Elisha ben Abuya, he is an other, right? And they're actually, in the Gnostic literature, there are other terms where the other is referred to that way. A heretic, a person, he's there and other. But here you see a cultural polemic, right? They're turning, those who are idolaters have become others to the culture. That practice makes you a non-Jew or non-Israelite, right? That's how they're reading it. So now they're talking about the in-group and the other group. The in-group worships the Lord alone, and the classic other is, in other words, that worship, that form of worship makes you into an other, not us, not unser, not our kind of people, right? But here you can see a perception of inner. What I'm trying to say is you can see all the different epistemological orientations now. Let's just do one more. I'm sorry.
Just one comment. This is not a. This doesn't go against halachic decrees. I mean, someone who is an acher, Shem Yisrael Adam Nikala, halachically speaking. Conceptually, it's a different matter.
Yeah, I think they're just saying that the people who worship this way have set themselves outside the pale, right? And that's what but what's powerful here is that the literal reading has to be a homiletical reading for it to be tolerated, and the assumption is this is the way you must read it if you're going to live with this text to make sense in a monotheistic culture, right? The polemic at the time of Moses was very different, and he had to say these are not gods, right? Literally, right? You can't have other gods, only this God. It's a very different culture war that's going on. Let's do one more, maybe of Rabbi Yossi.
Rabbi Yossi says, why does it say other gods?
That's the question.
In order not to give the nations of the world an excuse to say, were they to be called by the proper name, they would be useful.
Haya bahem tzorech. They would have validity, right? But they are called by its name, and they have none. So what is the go to the very end.
When else were they called by the proper name? In the days of Enoch, son of Seth, as it is said, it was then that men began to invoke by the name of the Lord. At that time the ocean rose and inundated a third of the world. God said to them, you have done a new thing, calling yourselves divine. I too shall do a new thing, and will call myself Lord. Thus it says, who summons the waters of the sea and pours them out upon the earth, his name is the Lord.
Yeah. So what's the force that's going on here? I think that they're actually not the way that they're reading is as huchal l'kro b'shem Hashem. It's not they began, but they desecrated from halal. In other words, what they're saying is, why does it say other gods? Because that a person shouldn't have the pretext of saying
that if they were called,
that if they were really called by this, they would have a legitimate function.
Yeah.
And so they are actually called this, and they have no legitimate function.
In a way.
So it's a clever thing with but you can use. But here you can see the culture trying to do a certain kind of work through these questions.
The final one doesn't talk about utilizing the name of God,
Right.
not Elohim Achirim,
Right.
utilizing the name
The
of God
name.
for myself.
Right. Yeah. Let's do maybe one more, and then we can stop. What does Rabbi Eliezer say?
other gods. They changed their gods every day. How so? He had an idol of gold, but needed the gold, so he made an idol of silver. He had an idol of silver, but needed the silver, so he made one of bronze. He had one of bronze, but needed the bronze, so he made one of iron. And so on with tin and lead, as it says, gods they had not known, new ones who came but lately.
Okay, that's the citation. So what's the force of this? Anybody who has the text in front of them? How are they reading? Elohim acherim, they are constantly making other gods, right? They're constantly making these gods have no substance. So one day they make a god out of silver, another make the god out of thing, then when it wears away they make a god out of something else. And so they're making mechadshim, they are renewing, making new kinds of gods all the time. So it's another kind of way of understanding the rabbinic take or irony or sarcasm about idolatry. In other words, there's no notion of spiritual permanence, but they're constantly making other things God. First they'll take a tree, we'll make it a God, then we'll make a piece of silver, we'll make it a God. Now we'll overlay it with gold and we'll make it a God. So other gods are constantly, other kinds of gods are constantly being invented. So here you see this is a little bit more theologically sarcastic, but you can again see that they're taking everything from the world and making them into other things.
Does this talk to a certain paradox between the unification of the divine, the unity of the divine world, and the ongoing history of interpretation, which is renewed from each and every stage? But
no, I think they're starting from an intolerable or an absolutely perplexing phrase in the Torah. No other gods. And they're trying first to answer it on the basis of could the text really have meant Elohim, gods? And they try to exhaust a series of possibilities. And then they come at the problem to say, well, what could be the meaning of acherim? Right? In other words, they first take one term and they do a series of riffs on one term. And then they take the other term, acherim, and they do a series of riffs on that. Other gods, they defer things, they make other kinds of things, they make you into another. And each one of these is allowing us to perceive a different dimension of the perception of idolatry for the collector of this collection, right? And in every single case, the literal meaning, the word of Scripture is kept, but the literal meaning is changed, and they're reading it according to the temper of their times. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting that the first interpretation serves as like the framework for all other interpretations so far. That the first interpretation interprets as the gods which others call God, and then from now on, every interpretation implies both this interpretation, and then Acherim is also interpreted on the second level as well, right? Because it's already implied that what we refer to as
you could read this as a series, as a chain of unfolding, or it's a series of a collection of multiple sermons that have been condensed around this. But what becomes intriguing is that the way they ask the question firstly, what could this mean? And then, what could it mean in relationship to this scripture, and et cetera, et cetera.
So just indicating about the editing interface that was kind of
Yeah.
This was very, very, very sophisticated.
All right. Anybody want to add anything more here to this particular? Okay, so you can go to the very end. You can see one more. But so next time, when we get, we'll go to the medieval material, beginning with the Sa'adiyya material. We'll go to the philosophical and the mystical, and the Keter, the crown of glory of Ibn Gabir. We'll see a whole series of, again, a very different way in which the questions, how Sa'adiyya, the philosopher, processed the questions of Job. Then a remarkable series of questions. The whole song of this classic poem of Ibn Gabir is pitched around questions. And we'll then see also the Halevi and the Zohar material. So these are all different levels and types of questions, all pertinent to different kind of strata of society or different kind of rabbinic mentalities, as we'll go through them and see how they're raising it. Yeah.
We don't meet
next week. No, I'm going to be in New York.
Okay.
And so we'll meet in 2 weeks.
Okay.
And then, depending on how far we get, if we have to meet maybe the last class for an extra hour or something like that, we'll figure that out. Okay?
The material on chat for the 17th is not for the 17th, right?
Yeah. No, I just wanted so that everybody, what's put on for 17th is for the week after the 17th. Yeah. And then the week after that will be the Levinas material. And then the week after that, or we'll combine that with some of the material of Hasidism and Bialik and things like that. We'll see how far we get on that material. Okay? But in other words, each one of the texts that I've chosen is, in a certain sense, emblematic of different, multiple ways in which one can think about the problematic of questions and how questions function. Obviously, we can't do anything comprehensive, but I think each one is showing how different types of genres work with different questions and allows you to see how fundamental this is in particularly Jewish terms. So I want to thank also Patrick again for the platform. Yeah. Thank you. Great stuff.
Actually, in Tibetan culture, aside from the debate thing, they clap their hands to ward off demons.
That's exactly what the Bratslav Hasidim do. Yes, it's if you go like this, or it's times 10 times. If you're having, it's really what it's called in Hebrew machshavot zarot. If you're in prayer and your mind is wandering and you're being attacked by all kinds of bad thoughts, so all of a sudden you can be in a Bratslav or a prayer house, a shtibel, or they shout or they screech. There'll be a kind of what is called a primal scream. Both are designed to get your head back into it. Yeah. As if it was an instrument. So you can't bang on the tape. Anything that would be like using something else as an instrument. Musical, like a drum. Shinoi. There you go. Yeah. All right. So now, anyway, this Pekian, you get how to get your head back together. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to make sure you got my.
I want to make sure I have it before I put it on. Yeah. You're right there.